Welcome back to Even Tacos Fell Apart, where we dive into the messy, beautiful, and sometimes downright gritty aspects of mental health. I'm MommaFoxFire, and I am beyond excited for today's episode. We are all just trying to navigate this wild journey with as much grace and resilience as we can muster, and it's not always easy, but that's where Even Tacos Fell Apart comes in. This podcast is a safe space to explore the messy parts of life, to shed some light on the struggles that we all face, and to remind each other that we're not alone in this crazy world. Today, we're diving headfirst into the intriguing world of psychiatry, mental health, and geekdom. And sometimes people hear psychiatry and geekdom in the same sentence and they go, huh? How do those even relate? But I truly believe that embracing all facets of our identities, whether that's our love for video games, comic books, or binge watching our favorite TV shows, they can all be critical pieces for our well-being. This interview was recorded long ago in 2021, so kind of a blast from the past here, straight from the archives of all these conversations that we've done. But today you'll hear my conversation with Gian Manuel Ramos Monserrate, a psychiatrist and researcher who's breaking down barriers and challenging stereotypes in the world of mental health. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of our conversation, I want to take a moment and reflect on why this topic is so important. Mental health affects each and every one of us, whether we realize it or not. And it's not just about the clinical diagnoses or the medications. It's about understanding ourselves, our struggles, and our journeys towards healing and growth. And all of these things we're going to talk about today tie directly into that. So grab your favorite cup of tea, cozy up on the couch, and get ready to embark on a journey of discovery. Because today's episode is not just about psychiatry or mental health, it's about embracing our true selves, finding strength in our vulnerabilities, and connecting with each other on a deeper level. All right, enough for me, enough chit chat. Let's dive into the heart of the matter. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Gian on psychiatry, mental health, and geekdom. Hello, happy Monday. Welcome back to another Mental Health Monday. I am really excited to have this conversation with you guys. This has been in the works for quite a while, but we are here tonight with Gian, and we are going to be talking about psychiatry, mental health, and geekdom. And I'm really excited to kind of talk about how those kind of combine and work with patient care. So just so you guys know who we're talking to, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest. Gian is a medical doctor working towards psychiatry residency and working with children and adolescents. He is an avid fan of all things geek, but mostly video games and anime. He is also a content creator for Geek Therapy, which you guys know how I feel about Geek Therapy, and co-host of two podcasts, Here Comes the Thought, which is a Steven Universe in Psychology podcast, and Otaku Ryoho, Geek Therapy's anime. Okay, good. Geek Therapy's anime podcast. I've got some socials for you guys. I've got, of course, the tags page for you guys and a link to Geek Therapy's website. If y'all are interested in connecting at all with our guest tonight, feel free to do that. And Gian, thank you so much for being here tonight. I appreciate you taking the time out.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Actually, we've been scheduling and unscheduling this for so long, and I've been hyped about it for a few months already, and so I'm happy to finally be here.
I know. It's fortunately it hasn't been super one-sided, right? It's been like I needed to reschedule, and then you needed to reschedule, and then I need to reschedule, and you need to. So it's been. I'm glad that it wasn't just me, because sometimes when I have to reschedule something a couple times, it's just me, and I'm like, oh shit, so they're gonna think that I'm completely, just off my rocker. So I'm glad that it's been on both sides. And I'm really glad that you weathered the storm. Okay. The hurricane that rolled through. I'm glad that you're doing well. Any damage to your property at all?
No, actually it was it turned out to be a tropical storm, and it didn't even pass by, but we had a lot of things canceled that day.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure not to make a commitment and then on the day off be like, oh no.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we totally would have understood if you hurricanes roll through, like acts of God or just out of our control for sure here.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us a little bit more about your experiences, kind of what made you become interested in specializing in health and now in psychiatry?
So I've always wanted to be a doctor. because my father is a OBGYN. He's a doctor himself. And growing up, I really admired his work with patient care. And if you look through my albums, I was the kid who made sure that all the plushies at school had their physicals done
Oh my
before they could play
gosh.
with all the other kids. Which I don't know if that's cute or if that I was like obnoxious in that sense, as it the other kids might were waiting for me to finish checking them up. But that's sort of how I grew up. My mom was a medical technician, so I was sort of born in the healthcare role, and that's sort of how I was interested in health,
Hmm.
in medicine specifically. But I didn't become interested in psychiatry until I was about 11 years old, where I was in around fifth grade, I would say, and there was a situation happening at home, and it was a source of a lot of stress. It was a professional sort of situation where my father was facing a lawsuit because so when you're a doctor in an OR,
Hmm.
well, everybody who works in an OR, if something goes wrong, the lawsuit goes to everybody who was in that room, right?
Yeah.
And so the details of the situation that was happening back then was that there was a patient who had a brief waking up during the surgery. She didn't feel any pain, but she woke up,
Oh
and
my
that could be a
gosh.
traumatic experience.
Yes.
But so usually that's the anesthesiologist's responsibility. But as lawsuits go, it goes to absolutely everyone in the room. And so my father was facing a lot of those issues with that lawsuit, and my mom became very severely depressed, right? And she had this experience where she went to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist evaluated her right next to my dad, like didn't give her the private space to have that conversation.
Oh
And then he
wow.
faced my dad and told him like, oh, this sounds really bad, like she doesn't sound good, this could be bad for your reputation, uh and stuff like that. And so when my
Oh.
father was facing all these horrible things about, about his reputation and his like livelihood, I think in many ways this psychiatrist did a lot of harm
Hmm.
for my mother, because he kind of reinforced the idea that, you're part of what's contributing to his, you know, to his like downfall. And so she became very depressed, and one day she just wanted to stay asleep for a very long time. She didn't have suicidal thoughts, but she just wanted to stay asleep, and she was taking benzodiazepines, which are drugs that can really like knock you down if you
Hmm.
take too many of them. And she overdosed on those. Um,
Wow.
and she lived through that whole experience. But during that time when I was 11 years old, I found myself to be like the caretaker of the family because my father was always at his job.
Hmm.
Um, and I had a lot of friends, some friends who were like going through suicidal thoughts. I had friends who were going through drugs, sort of things. And, it just became a natural part of my identity to be like a caretaker, right?
Hmm.
And so over time, that takes a toll on you. And all that compassion fatigue sort of like had an effect on me. And so there came a point where I saw a psychologist and I saw a psychiatrist, and they had an amazing effect on me. Both, taking medication and going to therapy, it was life changing. And I can definitely like sort of I can split my life before and after, right? I had that intervention. And I guess my initial interest in psychiatry came from that sort of like me trying to make odds with that. How could one person have such a horrible effect on my mom, and then somebody from the same specialty have like this effect on me that he really changed my life? He changed like the course of my life, right? With my interactions with them and, taking medication and going to therapy. And that's how I sort of came into the field of psychiatry, I guess.
Yeah. So do you kind of do you attribute, everything that was happening to your mom? Was that just a bad psychiatrist, or was that the way that things were at that time? Or do you think, because we've talked a lot on this channel about, making sure that if you're not getting the care that you need from your mental health provider, that you find one who is going to provide you with that care. So do you feel like your mom's psychiatrist was just not a great care provider, or do you think that that was kind of just the way that it was at the time?
I think it's easy to think about how things were back in the time, but I think the truth is you can read any textbook that was
Hmm.
written during that time, and it emphasizes the importance of having a private space of confidentiality, of
Yeah.
not having conversations around the patient, but towards the patient. Um, and I don't think it's a thing of the times. I think this person was a professional and they did not do their job as they were supposed to. And
Yeah.
then the thing is, like, my mom should have and could have, gone to somebody else for help when she didn't like quite click with that psychiatrist. But that already has such a strong impression on you, and first impressions are important because now you don't know whether you can trust
Right.
a healthcare worker, right? And that cuts deeply, right? Because you cut yourself from help because you've already found that help to not be helpful. So yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that it's hard if you get someone who is not what you need at the very beginning of when you seek care, because that is your impression on the whole field. And that's
Yeah,
bad. Like, I've talked about this pretty extensively in Discord, especially fairly recently. I had a horrible experience with a dentist. Not my first experience with a dentist, but I had a horrible experience with a dentist. I didn't go to a dentist for like probably 5 years after that. I was just like, no, no way. No way in hell am I going
yeah,
back. And so it's kind of the same if you, especially with your first interaction. Like, if I had gone to a dentist and what I experienced had been the first thing I had ever had in dentistry, I don't think I ever would have gone to another dentist in my entire life. But that's, that's okay. So, what
yeah.
is your favorite thing about working in the mental health field, and what are some of the biggest challenges that you've seen, or in the health field, and what are some of the biggest challenges you've seen?
Yeah. So my favorite part is the fact that so at first when I think most medical students have this illusion that, um or this idea that they're going to come into a room and they're going to save the patient and they're sort of going to be like the heroes of the story. I think it's something that pushes a lot of medical students into medicine. And I think one of the most beautiful things that I found is that in a hospital, you're part of a team. And then just for example, I think I found my passion in child and adolescent psychiatry, right? Which I could go a bit more into later. But when you have this kid, right, and you're talking to him and you're learning their story, and then you go back to your room and you have this certain ideas of what you can do to help. And then a psychologist comes in and he's like, hey, I talked to the kid. He says this, and that. And I just found this out. And then the social worker comes in and says, no, so this is the situation with the family. This is how I can help. And just like seeing, I think it's beautiful to see how a group of people just like band together to help somebody in need, just a single person in need, right? And I think, being a part of that every day is just extremely beautiful.
Yeah, kind of that team approach, right? And it sounds like you
Yeah,
guys really approach it from a more holistic perspective, which is really refreshing.
yeah. So that's at least in my experience working in hospital settings. I have still not worked on a private practice setting, but that's
Hmm.
something my dream is to be able to keep that up whenever I finish my own studies and I have my own private practice. See what types of connections I can make and try to bring the most comprehensive care. I think
Hmm.
it's that's the moonshot. That's what I hope to be able to accomplish.
And you're planning to go into private practice after you're done with your studies and everything?
So, that's still up for debate. I
Hmm.
think what I'm most so usually how it goes, psychiatrists have usually more than one job.
Hmm.
They don't usually just do the one thing. So I think I would like to work in a hospital setting, and I think I would also like to work in an academic setting. Because the way when most people tell me like, why did you want to do psychiatry and not anything else? The usual answer I have is that throughout my life, I've wanted to be three things. I wanted to be a doctor, I wanted to be a therapist, and I wanted to be a teacher. And I guess psychiatry lets me do all three,
Yeah.
right? And so that's just how I feel about it. And so being in an academic setting while still working in a hospital, I think that's what I want for now. But
Hmm.
I think I'd still have to experience what private practice is like. And I think one of the things you don't get in a hospital is that your patient is there for a few weeks and then they're gone, and you don't have that, taking care of them for months and years and seeing them evolve and grow. And that's something I think I would definitely miss from just working in a hospital. But I already love working in the hospital so much, so I don't know what life has in store for me, but I think I'll love it either way.
That's exciting. That's an exciting thing to
Yeah,
just be like, I have the flexibility to kind of try some different things. I have the desire to try some different things, and then you can kind of settle where you want to settle, right? That's a beautiful
yeah.
thing. What are some of your favorite hobbies, and do you feel that wow, I'm going to start that one over because that was
Okay, don't
awful.
worry.
My mouth just like would not move in the way that I wanted to move. What are some of your favorite hobbies, and do you draw any distinctions between self-care and what you consider just like straight hobbies?
Hmm. So usually, I think one of my biggest hobbies is the podcasting part. Um,
Hmm.
I think it sort of goes in unison with like what I said before about loving to work with teams and working with, professionals. I just like hearing smart people talk about what they're smart about or what they like. You know what I mean? Like seeing professionals be good at what they are is just like invigorating. And that's somehow what I found through geek therapy. When I
Hmm.
started doing like the podcasting thing, my first podcast was like the Here Comes the Thought podcast.
Hmm.
So I sort of combined something that I like, which is like watching TV shows like Steven Universe, right? And then I sort of combine it with my academic aspirations. And so what I do there is like I talked to what was then a psychology student and a MFT in training, right? And we're just talking about the same thing but with our own different perspectives. And I think that's somehow like I saw something I loved in my job and I wanted to apply it to my hobbies as well. I wanted to take it back home, and I guess in a sense you could say that's sort of self-care because I get to maintain that sense of motivation and that sense of being part of something, but at the same time, it doesn't require me to always be on point with my studies and stuff like that. Like, we're just talking about a TV show. And so, yeah, I love TV shows. Um, I love video games, and I really love anime. And so, being able to share my passion for that with my passion for my career, I would consider that a hobby, and I would also consider that self-care.
Hmm.
um it's strange because it also requires work, and sometimes I'm like I don't want to do it, but like as soon as I start doing it, I already feel better for it.
Yeah.
Like I never feel as I'm doing the podcast like, oh, I'd rather be somewhere else. um and so cooking, I love to do the cooking at home. um Reading mostly nonfiction, and I like writing, but I usually like I write in short bursts, like Like one day it's just when inspiration strikes, that's pretty much
Mm-hmm.
it. I can't like consistently write for the life of me. But yeah, I think those would sort of sum up my hobbies.
What kind of thing do you enjoy writing?
So lately, I really like the idea of cosmic horror. I like, I think one of the most interesting forms of horror is the idea of something that is bigger than you or something that you can't control. And I think it's an experience that somebody who works in the psychiatric in the psychiatric field,
Mm-hmm.
right, can really relate to. When you have this kid that has a lot of problems at home, has a lot of problems at school, and you can, help him deal with that through therapy and medication, but sometimes it feels like it's not enough. I think that feeling of hopelessness is something that should be expressed, especially by healthcare practitioners. Like, it's okay to feel overwhelmed, and the fact that we keep on trying, even if when we're overwhelmed, I think that's the horror that I love to talk about, like the idea of like finding something so insurmountable, but still trying to keep your sense of self and identity and drive through it all. I think that's sort of what I write about when I write about cosmic horror.
So it's a little bit informed kind of like by what you do to an extent,
Yeah,
right? I like that
yeah,
you can
definitely.
kind of take your experiences and put that into something that you enjoy outside of work too. That's a really nice thing to have. And you said you also enjoy reading. Do you have a favorite book or genre of books?
So generally, in terms of, so I have ADHD, and I was diagnosed during medical school because I went through the
What a
great majority
time.
of my life. Yeah, no, it was a treat. So I went through the great majority of my life. I remember having teachers who evaluated me and said, like, he's really smart, and when he raises his hands, you see that he has sort of like a passion for it, but he doesn't give his homework, and he consistently forgets and pays and is not paying attention. And when I was in med school, I was struggling, um, and that was when I actually found this out. Like I remember, having arguments with my mom about, I'm trying really hard, but I can't get there. And then I found out that there were letters at home about, teachers telling her he should be evaluated for ADHD. And back then she just didn't want to accept that she had a flawed kid, right? So she said, no, he's just lazy. He just needs to work harder. Um, and back to the book question. So over time, like I think reading books is kind of difficult for me. Um, but I definitely like to listen to audiobooks. I think one of my favorite horror books is House of Leaves. It's a very like experimental book where you have to like
Yes.
just
Yes.
it's like a very long novel and you have to like flick the book over and read
Mm-hmm.
like the footnotes that sort of they take over the whole page, which is it's a very interesting experimental book, and I think my ADHD brain really sort of like vibed with that sort of form of storytelling where everything is interactive. But my favorite book of all time, it's a book that my high school girlfriend, which is now my wife, um,
Oh.
bought for me when I was in 12th grade. So we used to have a Borders here in Puerto Rico, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is like the only big chain bookstore that we've ever had. And I used to love it there. It was like my hangout spot 100%. Um, and there we had there was like this calendar section, and that calendar section had this calendar that I was obsessed with because of the art, but I didn't know that it was referring to a book. And one day for my birthday, she got me the book that the art of the calendar was for, right? And so I have the book right here. It's called The Museum of Lost Wonder. And as you see, it's like a very
Oh,
like it
wow.
looks like an alchemical sort of like
Uh-huh.
thing. and that sort of like hermetic art. I think if I can sort of bring up another page, it has like this sort of art
Oh,
style.
that's
Okay.
beautiful.
And
That is
so
beautiful, really.
the book itself, it's like a self-help book, but it's sort of coded in this idea of like you go through a museum, and the museum has like exhibits, right? And so it takes the different forms of like alchemical processes, like evaporation or stuff like that, but then uses them as a form of reflection. So as to show like what things about you do you feel make you more connected to like the sublime or stuff like that. And sort of like mixing that sort of psychology with magic, I think that's what really brought me into this book because it sort of framed, it was like role playing, right?
Yeah.
It frames the idea of working on yourself and navel gazing, but from a magical standpoint. And it's one of like every time I look at it, it's like, wow, this book is just beautiful. And I have a lot, whenever I role play or stuff like that, I always play the mage. I always play magic user. I think I have this fascination with like, what if you have knowledge and you can use that to like be a force for good, right? Like you don't need to have strength. You just have to know the steps or know the words to speak in order to help people. And I think that book sort of like really encompasses why I love like the magical aesthetic, like the alchemy sort of magical aesthetic and using that to sort of talk about yourself and self exploration. I think it's a book that I always cherish. There's also a website where you can sort of explore the museum like through Flash animation.
Oh,
Um,
that's
so
cool.
it's pretty cool as well. Yeah.
That's neat. And this description, so I looked it up on Goodreads just because whenever I have guests, like I said, I always wind up adding something to my Goodreads that I haven't read before. So I've read House of Leaves, which I love that you compared that to like it kind of was pleasing to your ADHD brain because to me, reading that book, I was in high school when I read that book, and it wasn't like an assignment or anything. I just read it. It was weird, and it was neat that it was weird, but it didn't like super resonate with me the way that it was put together. So it's interesting to hear you kind of put it that way a little bit. But the description on this Museum of Lost Wonder, it says, think McSweeney's production values and design pyrotechnics. Think traditional esoteric symbols in a childhood garden of wonder. Think graphic novel and an adult version of the coolest activity book ever made, and it'll be somewhere in the neighborhood. Like that's just if that doesn't draw you in and make you want to read this book, I don't know what will.
I absolutely love it. I can't stop looking at it. It's been like 12 years and I still,
Mhm.
look at it every single often.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. That's great. And so sweet that you married your high school sweetheart. That's fun. Not a lot of people can say that these days.
Yeah.
So I know that the past year and a half, year and however many months it's been, because what does time mean anymore, have been really challenging, especially
Mhm.
to those in the healthcare field. So, what have been some of your biggest challenges, and have you had any wins in this time?
Yeah, definitely. I think in hospitals, I think people see hospitals as a place of dread and a place of, this is where sick people go. Um, they see it as a place of death. And I guess for me growing up, because I grew up around hospitals and I grew up next to my father, I actually see hospitals as places of hope. Whenever I'm at a hospital, I feel hopeful because I know that everybody there, like, they've learned through years of like study and practice to be there to take care of people at their time of need. And so more often than not, I see successes in the hospital. And I know I talked earlier about, the feeling of being overwhelmed with like having these sort of failures that you feel are out of your control. Um, but more often than not, what you see, especially in psychiatry, is, you know, kids come in because they either had a suicidal attempt or had intense suicidal thoughts. And being there and being able to relate to them and see them grow through the process. I think one of the best parts is the beginning where your interaction with them, they're like, this is just another adult who doesn't get me, right? And you get to have that interaction with them where you're like, I want to get your part of the story. And they're like, wait, somebody actually wants to listen to me. And being able to develop that relationship. And then when they leave the hospital, they thank you, or they say like, hey, I felt heard by you. Like having those interactions, I think more often than not, I think I feel hopeful whenever I'm working in a hospital. And I know that I think it also mostly speaks to the fact that I work in psychiatry, and perhaps I don't work, in COVID wards, which are like, it's a whole different story.
Yeah.
But it is, for example, I had an experience working in an ICU, and working in an ICU can be very harsh because everything you do is measure everything that comes in and out of the patient's body, right? And so most of the patients are unconscious, so you can't even talk to them. Um, I think the times where I've felt the most hopeless is actually when I get patients who die alone. I think before I wanted to go into child and adolescent psychiatry, which was during my third year of medical school. Before that, I always thought I was going to go into substance use psychiatry. That's because most of my sort of like volunteer experiences growing up were in substance use settings, or like people in the underserved communities where substance use was very present, right? And so one thing I see very often, and it always breaks my heart, is having these patients who, because of the nature of substance use, they burned a lot of bridges throughout their lives. They've done things that they regret, and then seeing them at the last moments of their life, like when their liver is failing and like most of their organ systems are failing, and sometimes like they'll be calling out to someone or something, like it can be very heart-wrenching. But at the same time, knowing, like holding their hands through their process, and giving them that palliative care, that end of life care, um, and even if it's just a stranger that takes care of you and listens to you, um, like it's me that's there helping them and sort of like making the end more comfortable. I think that makes the hopelessness lesser. The fact that I was able to do something is better than seeing it and not being able to do anything. You know what I don't know if I'm expressing myself correctly, but it's sort of like that feeling that even if it's just a pebble, right, you did something, and that can put your mind at rest. That even if the world has many horrible things in it, um, you could just make it less horrible.
Yeah, I mean, being there at the end of someone's life and just being able to make a difference, like you can clearly see that you're making a difference. And it sounds like you really enjoy that hospital setting where you are very clearly, while that patient is there, you are dedicated to helping them. I mean, that's a great thing to be able to say and to be able to kind of have in your day-to-day job, is just the ability to support people around you and support the patients that you see. I think that that's something that it sounds very fulfilling to me. Not that I want to go back to school at all, because good Lord, I do not, and I would not, and I am not. But that does sound, that sounds very, very fulfilling, quite honestly. How important is it for the patients that you see to have a variety of engagement with their care providers? And so you talked a little bit about the, the social worker coming in and the psychiatrist coming in and the doctor coming in and like all of these different care providers. So how important is it for those patients to have medication, therapy, social, culture, language, like their interests kind of combined into care?
I think one of the beautiful things about working in mental health care is the idea that every person is a universe, like in and of themselves. And I think being able to have access to every single form of treatment is something that everybody deserves as a human being. And when it comes to psychiatry and medication, medication is not for everyone, right?
Mhm.
And I think that that should always come first and foremost. So the way, for example, so the way depression works. In psychiatry, we have a very rigid, just like definition of depression, right? Which is like the DSM criteria. And a lot of people, you know, have reasonable criticisms for the idea of DSM criterias because like it doesn't encompass everything about depression. But the thing is this, right? So for depression, there's this mnemonic that medical students learn, right? Which is SIGI CAPS. Um, and that's like S is for sleeplessness, I is for decreased interests and stuff like that. G is for guilt, E is for energy, like they have low energy. C is for concentration, like they have decreased concentration, which is like why you can't treat ADHD without treating depression first, because you don't know which one comes first. Um, then you have like problems with appetite, problems with movement, and finally like suicidal ideation. The reason why you have those symptoms, right? And it's specifically those symptoms, it's because those are the symptoms that medication can treat,
Mhm.
right? And so when I say my mom died yesterday and I can't sleep, but that's the only thing I have, like medication isn't necessarily for you. Maybe you should go through therapy, right? Because just because you don't have five of the like of that list of symptoms, which is like the diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder,
Mhm.
it doesn't mean you're not depressed. And I think that's a distinction that a lot of people struggle with when somebody says like, "Oh, I'm so depressed," and somebody says like, "No, you been diagnosed?" And you don't have to be diagnosed. Depression is a state of mind. It's not necessarily a diagnosis. Major
Mhm.
depressive disorder is a diagnosis, right? And so when you have major depressive disorder, which is like you have that list of symptoms, that's what medication can actually help you with. Because sadness is not, in that case, sadness is having physical symptoms with you. And so you're always going to find patients that can benefit more from therapy and others who benefit more from medication. And there's some people say that, medication should be like a last attempt. Like if therapy doesn't work for you, then try medication. I don't necessarily agree with that. And I can sort of talk about my own personal experiences. So when I was in medical school, I struggled for 4 years. So sorry, for 2 years to pass a specific exam,
Mhm.
right? And that took 4 attempts of that exam, and I passed it on my fifth exam. And that was a 2 years of cyclic torture because I was studying for like months at a time, then taking the test and failing it, right? And so over time, I became depressed. And I saw a lot of therapists, and they told me all the things that I already knew because I've studied psychology, right? Like I know CBT. So when
Mhm.
they're like, "Oh, these are your like distorted thoughts," like I know how it works, right? And they taught me mindfulness and breathing, and I was like, "Well, I know how to breathe and stuff like that." Like I try to practice it, but I just don't have the motivation, the concentration. I'm not sleeping well enough. Like I'm sleeping too much and I'm eating too much. Because I'm trying to keep myself stimulated. But then by eating too much, I have that Thanksgiving effect where you like want to go back to sleep, right? And so it was like this toxic pattern that it was when somebody who's studying for psychiatry and was still like, I don't need medication, like I'm not one of those people. Well, it turns out I actually needed medication, which is ironic for somebody who's like studying psychiatry to be so apprehensive about taking medication. um, but when I started taking medication, I was actually able to start incorporating all the valuable information that my psychologists and therapists were giving me. And so my case specifically was this case where I needed to go on medication so I could, take care of those physical symptoms. So actually, I could actually apply what I had learned, and then slowly come off medication. I'm not taking medication right now for depression, um, because I already had, I had stabilized my life, and I had, dealt with all those things what were the triggers for my depression. And
Yeah.
so I think in my case, I had to take that medication before I took in the therapy. Similarly, like there's people, like I said, like if you don't have all those Siggy cap symptoms, right? Um, and you really struggle with your relationship with somebody or with your distorted thinking or stuff like that, you might just benefit from therapy the most. And so what research says is that medication is as good as therapy, but that if you put them both together, you're more likely to get out of it, right? And I think part of it is that because when you do both of them together, you're covering all your bases,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the person who might need medication first is being covered, and the person who might need therapy first is being covered, and the person who has something rather severe or moderate that might need both of them is also getting covered. So I think more like generally, I think comprehensive care is like the most important part, like being able to take a little bit from anybody who can give you some sort of help. And that's, you know, that's your psychiatrist, that's your psychologist, that's a social worker, that's an advocate, that's a peer, right? That's going through the same thing that nobody, like, no matter how much I study your condition, nobody will understand it in the same way as somebody who's actually gone through it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think advocacy work is like, and peer work is like extremely valuable. And so it just goes to show like there's a million different ways to solve a puzzle, and everybody is a different puzzle. So it's all about learning your story and referring them to the best resources that they can have, right? And if medication is useful, then it's medication. And if it's not useful, then it's referring to the proper services. I think that's the best way we can do justice to everybody that comes into, a healthcare practitioner's office.
Yeah, and I like what you said about everyone being a puzzle and you can solve a puzzle a whole bunch of different ways, right? Because if you go into a single kind of provider and you go in and you only see a therapist and they're not a person who pushes medication, they're not going to recommend it. They're going to recommend CBT. Or if you go in specifically to, like in my case, whenever I had postpartum depression, I just was covering it with my OBGYN. They were able to just prescribe medicine, which worked for me because it was postpartum depression. And so that worked. That was what I needed. Now, with what I have now, like I have to incorporate all these different aspects of care because it's not just one thing that's going to help me. But if you go and see one kind of provider, instead of getting that variety of those different providers who understand where you're coming from, who understand where you've been, who understand what can help you most, I think you're missing out. I think you're missing out if you're not including all of your care providers in your whole scope of care. Now, maybe that's not in a hospital setting, maybe it's different appointments, and maybe they're not all in one room, and that's okay, as long as you're communicating with all of them what the other ones have said. that's still really important. Yeah. And in the case of kids, how important is it to involve the parents in the care?
I think it's extremely important. I think more often than not, problems with kids tend to be problems with adult figures in their life, because often, when we're kids, we learn from our surroundings, right? And when it comes to even like coping skills or stuff like that, it's very important to address what's happening at home. So part of
Mm-hmm.
what I love about child and adolescent psychiatry is that being a doctor for a kid means that you're treating the whole family. It also means that you're being the kid's advocate.
Yeah.
And that I think that's part of what's beautiful for the job. Part of what I really love was calling the parents and getting to know their stories and what they've struggled with, and being able to guide parents and let them know. Sometimes, you have these wonderful parents that really care, but perhaps they weren't, they didn't have those mental health toolboxes
Hmm.
to be able to take care of their kids when something bad happens in their life, and sort of like being able to guide those parents and tell them like, okay, so this is a way we can go about this, and telling the kids like, hey, look what happens when you negotiate with your parents, right? And you're like, hey, I'll do my homework and then I can play Fortnite and stuff like that. And like negotiating just like that contract and that language of, let's see how we can get your parents to listen to you, but also let's see how you can listen to your parents, and
Hmm.
be able to like have that relationship and bond form and strengthen those family ties. It's a beautiful thing to work with. um and it doesn't, I think, as a healthcare provider, you are a representative of adults. Um, Whenever a kid comes into your office, like, they'll see you and they'll see you just as another adult, and it's your job to also like let them know that adults are just children that feel they figured things out, and they've settled onto a pattern, right?
Hmm.
This is how you are an adult, and they're like playing that out. But like deep inside, we're still figuring things out. And I think when kids sort of like find that out, I think it's empowering for them, because it lets them know like we're all vulnerable in this process and we're all trying to learn from each other,
Hmm.
and like the tighter we work together, the better we can get through hard times. um so yeah, I it's essential, it's important. And part of what I love about, again, child and adolescent psychiatry is that I work with a team, but also I take care of his family. I don't just take care of a patient.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. That is really wonderful because you can make an impact on a bigger scale. Hey, Link, how are you? Link said, "Can you imagine if that was the norm? Getting everyone on the same page, all the care providers? Yeah, it would be nice if that was the typical
Mhm.
process, but at least here in the U.S., it's just not."
No, you'll definitely get those things in Puerto Rico as well.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
yeah.
I guess you just like I said, you hope for the best cases,
Hmm.
and for the worst cases, you can definitely do some work around found family, right? And like there's always different ways to go about it, but I think sometimes I think one of the most valuable things we can have are fulfilling relationships, and we have to work hard to find those.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's not always biological family that's gonna get you there.
that's very, very true.
Yeah.
So Bite has a question and says, so she asks, "What is your favorite poem?"
So my favorite poem is um I forgot the name of the poem, but it's by John Donne, and it's about death.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Let me make sure. Death Be Not Proud by John Donne.
Ah.
That's my favorite poem. I remember I actually used that for a literature class that I had in college, where you had to sort of perform a poem. And it's a mystic poem about, it says, "Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those who thou thinkest thou dost overthrow die not, because death is like a short rest," right? This is a Christian author just like talking to death and letting him know, like, don't be proud. Like, you're not a big thing that everybody should be afraid of. Like, when you take poppy, which is like literally like opium, right? When you drink the milk of poppy, you go to sleep for longer. Like, when you die, it's just a momentary rest, and when you open your eyes, you're in heaven. And so you shouldn't be so proud. Like death is just like this fleeting thing. And I think like the way he writes that poem and sort of like as a victory over this fear of death, I think is one of the most beautiful poems I've ever read. So I think that ranks high as one of my favorite poems.
I love that. And Bite said, I know it's a random question, but I really love the answers that we've gotten. And what a perfect time for Link to be here. Yes, death positive. There you go. That is perfect. How do you, as a health provider, decide to tie gaming or geek culture with your patient's care?
So essentially part of how I learned that my true calling was for children and adolescents was that when I started working with them, you know, it's very common for them to feel like they're not entitled to their what they like. And I think this is something that is very common in the US, also in Puerto Rico, right? Like this idea that video games rot their minds, or that all
Yeah.
that sort of yeah, a stigma, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I talk to kids, being able to listen to what they like and being able to relate to them on those grounds is one of the most beautiful experiences you can have. And I'll use an example, which is like right now I'm working on my residency papers and I'm applying for my residency. And so I have to write a personal statement. So this conversation is really helping me sort of sort my thoughts about that. So thank you.
Yay!
And so one of my biggest experience was when I was working in a hospital in the Bronx. Um, and I was working in what you call the consultation liaison service, which is when you practice psychiatry, but for patients in a hospital with medical conditions, right? And I was working in a pediatric hospital. And more often than not, what you would find is kids who had just overdosed on medications. So they had to be in a medical ward. They couldn't be in a psychiatric ward because they had to go through all the detox. But then you have psychiatrists that go room to room and sort of like evaluate them and talk to them and stuff like that. And so that was a service I was working in. But back then, I was assigned to this one patient because his family was strictly Spanish speaking. And so I'm bilingual, and actually my native language is Spanish, and like English is my secondary language. And so they assigned me this patient because I spoke Spanish, I could speak to the family fluently. And this kid was a kid who had a Helicobacter pylori infection, which is this bacteria that creates ulcers in your stomach. And for most people, like you just take antibiotics and it goes away pretty quickly. Like you're gonna throw up a lot and stuff like that. But once you take the antibiotics, it usually goes away pretty quickly. But this kid had a very resistant infection. He was from the Caribbean. He was taken to New York because he had gone through months of not being able to get through that infection, right? And
Wow.
so he was throwing up a lot, and over time he became severely malnourished. By the time I saw him, he was less than 1% of his expected weight at that age. And so what that happens is that his
Gosh.
brain didn't have enough nutrients, right? And so you could see the bones of this kid, right? And he was in this catatonic state where he couldn't move and he couldn't interact with anything outside, like in the environment. It was almost like he wasn't even there. And so my job was to make sure that he was right on his medication regimen, but also try to talk to him and try to get him to engage with the outside world. And so as a medical student, I was like, how am I going to do this with somebody who can't even react to what I'm doing, right? And so most of the recommendations were like, go to him, talk about the weather, talk about the day, and that's like really boring conversation for a kid, right?
Right. That's
But
what
it
a
was
kid
like
cares
all I
about is
could.
the weather.
Yeah, exactly. And so I had a few days of just like being, oh, how are you? Like, look at this, it's so nice. Look at the weather. And it was like awkward conversation because what do
Yeah.
you talk about? Like, I don't even know this kid. And what happened is that one day he got this like box of belongings back from his hometown. And one of the things that he had was this copy of Naruto Ninja Storm, one of the many Ninja Storm games, right? Um, and so I remember when I was in high school, I started watching Naruto when it was first coming out to the US. And I watched a few episodes. I really loved it. And then it came to, I think it was Toonami or Adult Swim, one of both. But then I got like this hipster rage, like everybody was watching it, and I was like, I'm not gonna watch it anymore because everybody likes it and I hate it now. And so that was me back then. But right now, in this one moment, I found something to connect with this kid with, right? And so I brought that game to his mom and I was like, hey, I saw this game. And she was like, oh, yeah, like, I don't know why they brought that. I don't like him playing violent video games. Like, like this isn't allowed at home. And I was like, no, no, it's fine. It's okay. Like, I actually love this game and I love the story. So can I talk to him about this? And she was like, fine. So I sat down with him and I was like, "So, who's your favorite character?" And he he didn't respond, but his mom said like, "Oh, his favorite character is the one with the black hair." And then like there's a lot of characters with black hair, but I knew exactly who she was talking about, which was Sasuke, which he's like the edgy, powerful character in the anime. And so I was like, "Do you like Sasuke?" And in that one moment, his eye sort of like flickered, like you could see his eyebrows raise. And I was like, he's interested in
Hmm.
what I'm saying. And so I was like, my favorite character is Shikamaru, and then you could see him react to that. And I was like, I'm getting a reaction because I'm engaging for the first time with this kid. And I
Hmm.
always like to say, like, they assigned me this case because I spoke Spanish, but I succeeded with this case because I spoke anime,
Yeah.
right? And what I did was like I asked my attending for permission. Like I was lucky to be in a hospital that had PlayStations and Switches. And I was like, can I just like after I'm done with today's work, can I just like play with him the game? And he was like, sure, do whatever you think is best. So that's what I did. Every day after I finished my work, which was around 5 p.m., I would make sure to come to his room, and on my extra time, I would play with him. And it was a fighting game, so I played it at the hardest difficulty because I hoped that the tension would get him to jump in his seat, as kids tend to do, you know, when they're sort of like standing up and jumping in place when they're excited about something. And that's exactly what happened over the next few days. Um, he started just like jumping in place. He started getting off of the bed. He started like standing up and walking. Um, and by the end of the time he was there in the hospital, he was still not speaking, which was like mainly the biggest issue. Um, but he could eat because throughout all the time he was being fed through a tube, right? But by the end of the time, he could actually eat like processed foods or like shakes or stuff like that, nutritional supplements. And so when he left, that's how he was. And then 2 weeks later, we had a follow-up visit with him. And when I saw him, like I was just joking around with him, and I said, like, your mom told me that you can now stay here forever with me, and like I'm gonna keep you and I'm gonna adopt you. And he said, like, no, and then he hid behind his mom's back. And like that was the first time in that whole month of work that I had heard him speak.
Hmm.
And I think that experience sort of inspired me. And it just goes to show just you can connect with people on the stories that they relate to. Like sometime along all the time what we had there, I learned that part of the reason he had stopped eating was because as he was throwing up a lot, I think his brother was sort of bullying him, and his brother would tell him that the reason he's throwing up is because food was toxic to him. So like if he kept
Oh,
eating,
wow.
he would die. And so I think it sort of like infused him with this fear of death by eating. And so it's sort of like and this was a kid that was ostracized at school. He felt alone, he didn't have many friends. And so the way he sort of like related to characters in Naruto, and Naruto being a story like a very strong story about, being ostracized and feeling alone. um, I see how this kid could relate to that story. And then writing off of that was what helped me sort of like take care of him. And ever since then, I always start my first sessions with every single one of my patients with like, what would you do on Saturday if you had the day to yourself? And usually they'll say like, oh, I'll watch TV, or like I'll watch cartoons. And I was like, what type of cartoons? He's like, just like Japanese cartoons. And I'd be like, you mean anime? And they're like, oh, you know the term anime. And I'm like, yeah, what's your favorite anime? And then if I recognize that anime, I'll be like, I'll try to weave that in to the conversation about mental health, right? So I get a lot of kids who, for example, relate to characters in My Hero Academia, which is like the shonen anime. That's pretty much like the anime Avengers is how I call it, right? Because it's all about heroes doing hero things, and everybody has their own powers. And so, for example, I had this one patient once that um, she classified herself as a fighter, right? She's somebody who had two brothers who were bullies, and the way she talked to me, she was like, I have to fend for myself, right? I had to learn to fight in order to survive. And she was somebody who, my first impression of when you first meet her is that you get this feeling of intimidation, that she's putting this wall between you and her so she doesn't get hurt, right? And her favorite character was this character called Bakugo, which he's like the bully character in the series. But as the series goes on, you learn that his self-image is tied to the idea that he's stronger than others. And that by being stronger than others, that means he'll never be weak, and he'll never be taken advantage of. Um, and I was able to have this conversation with her to say like, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about Bakugo, right? And Bakugo, I think he's a very relatable character because nobody likes to feel weak. And she was like, yeah, I can relate to that too. And so I broached that subject with her by talking about fictional characters.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, it was like we were talking about her. We weren't talking about fictional characters. But it's because I could relate to the story that she could relate to, that we could then like use that as a vehicle to talk about mental health topics. And just exploring the millions of ways in which that could happen, and seeing that like in the geek therapy community, seeing everyone just like explore those ideas, I think it's beneficial to therapeutic work.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a lot. I just said a lot.
No, that's okay. And you are getting some validation in chat from Frost, who says Shikamaru is a good choice.
Yeah, I always go for the smart character.
Yes, absolutely. Link, I will give treats to the kitty after this interview so that you can see it on the cat cam. Because right now, if I give him treats, you're not gonna be able to see it. But whenever this is wrapped up, you'll be able to see him on the cat cam, and I'll give him treats. But I see it. I see that redemption. I'll get it. Is it always the patient who benefits from this sort of connection? Have you ever had any instances where it was the parents or the family that were the ones that you connected with to the benefit of the patient still, but not necessarily the patient themselves?
No, definitely, definitely. I think one of the biggest ways in which this happens is kids' relationship with gaming, right? So we'll often have this case where kids they don't want to do their homeworks. They just want to play Fortnite because Fortnite is where their meaningful social connections are,
Look,
right?
same. I
Especially during
mean,
the pandemic. Yeah. Especially during the pandemic where they couldn't go to school.
yeah.
Like this was their primary way of maintaining their social relationships. And so I had this situation where I worked in a hospital and as a medical student, um, I wanted to see how the therapist worked with the kids, right? I wanted to learn how it was outside of the field of psychiatry. But what I saw was that we had a group session in which they talked about, managing their anger or managing their emotions. And so the therapist said, so, what is one thing that makes you really angry, right? And so one of the kids said, I hate it when my mom tells me to go do chores as I'm in the middle of a game, of a play session. And so I tell her that I can't pause the game, but she doesn't understand that.
Hmm.
And I tell her, like, I'll get to it as soon as I pause the game, but then my mother will come in and like unplug the computer, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that really irritates me because it also embarrasses me in front of my friends,
Hmm.
um, as I'm playing with them. And what the therapist said at the moment was like, yeah, but Fortnite is bad for you. And if if now that I know this, I will warn your parents not to let you play Fortnite because Fortnite is a violent video game, and so you shouldn't be allowed to play Fortnite. It's not in your age range, right? And she was like 11 years old. Like Fortnite
Aw,
is a
come on.
teen
Yeah.
game, but like really, are you gonna really? No. Um,
Video
and
games are
I
the
think what
devil.
she actually, yeah, and I think what she actually did right there is destroy her therapeutic relationship
Yeah.
with that kid.
Hmm.
It let that kid know I am the adult that doesn't understand you. Like I think that what you do is evil. I think what you do is detrimental to you. What you like to do with your friends and your only form of connection with friends is like bad for you. So I am going to do everything possible to take that connection away from you.
Mm.
Um, and so after that, I sat down with a kid and then I had a conversation with the parents, just letting them know, like, so right now in the pandemic, you can't have kids playing basketball together.
Yeah.
You can't have kids, visiting each other's houses. But what this kid does have is Fortnite right now. And so we have to come to grips with that and see how we can actually leverage gaming to get your kid to do those chores and stuff like that, right? And so part of why I negotiated with the kid is like, what if you have this conversation with your mom before it happens, right? Before she asks you to do the chores. And so we made this plan where it was like, what are you going to tell your mom? And it was like, so mom, I want to talk about gaming and stuff like that. That this is the only way I get to talk with my friends and stuff like that. So I can make a contract with you in which like we have clear goals as to what my chores should be and what my goals should be daily. And if I get those done, like I get to play and uninterrupted, right? Unless like there's an emergency or stuff like that. Um, and this was like I was negotiating with both the parent and the child about their habits and like what they're both comfortable with in terms of compromise. And at the end of the day, the mom told me like I actually want to learn a bit more about Fortnite, and she started like playing Fortnite with her kid. Um, and that in the end like just greatly improved the relationship that she had with her mother,
Hmm.
right? And like being able to see that it's it goes to show like you can use it. I think parents sort of distance themselves from learning what their kid likes and like being an active part of your kid's media consumption. And I think that's a very important part, being able to connect with them on their desires, the media that they connect with, and the narratives that they connect with. I think it's very essential to be able to be an active part of that and want to learn more about your kid and what they like. And I think, making that connection with parents and kids, like, hey, did you know this series? Like, I have moms that tell me, like, my kid is into My Hero Academia, but I think it's violent and I don't know. I'm scared that my kid will turn violent or something. And having that conversation with the mom of like, well, so look at this. I know you've been struggling a lot with the fact that you're divorced and you feel like that's had effect on your kid, right? So, your kid was comfortable with me telling this to you and sort of having this conversation with you. Like, she really relates to one of the characters that has a single mom, and like feeling like a lot of people would find that as a negative, but this one character feels like they've received more love from their mom than most people will receive in their lifetime. Like, how do you feel about that? That they relate with this message so much, and it's through the narrative and the show that she was watching. And her mom was like, I never knew about that. Like, now I'm interested in watching the show with her. And like making those connections is just wonderful. I
Mm-hmm.
think it does contribute not only to the kids, but also to the relationship between parents and kid, which would in turn help the kids and will help
Yeah.
make my job easier. Because also, as a psychiatrist, it's not only important to have a good relationship with the kids, but also with the parents, which will be the ones who will go to the pharmacy and purchase the medication, who
Mm-hmm.
will like give that kid that structure to take their medication, and who will come to you with questions when they're scared about side effects, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have a bad relationship with the parents and the kid has some form of side effects, they won't come to you, you know, asking you like, "Oh, I'm afraid of this." Like they'll just stop the medication altogether. And I
Yeah.
think it's very important to leave that door open and have that wonderful relationship with the parents that you can work off of,
Yeah.
and you can make both the parent and the child feel comfortable around you and asking questions and being doubtful of treatment, because that's what makes good treatment, just giving, empowering everybody who has any stakes in the treatment and the kid and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. You need something, babe? No, it's not ghost time. It's bedtime. Do you need something or are you just... It's okay. Just go back to bed. I love you. Okay. Boy, he should have been asleep a long
Further
time
around the
ago.
corner.
But he's not. I know. He came, his room is right there, but the bathroom's right here. And so normally he would just walk like through my office, but he did good. He walked out there and he saw that I was on a stream, and so he was like, I'm gonna go all the way. So he went all the way around, but then you saw him as a ghost. So looks like ghost time to me. Yes.
October's right around the corner.
It's very true. Bites that I do at least try to understand the stuff my kid is into, even if it's not going to be my new favorite thing. It's important to her, so I try to make it important to me. And I agree. I mean, I do stuff. You saw my ghost behind me. I try to do stuff with him quite a bit, and he likes to play Among Us, and like he tried to teach me to play Minecraft, but that didn't go over super well. But he'll show me stuff, like he'll bring me the computer and show me something, or he'll bring me my phone when he's playing on it and show me something, and I try to at least give it some attention, you know. And same with my 14-year-old, although they're not really into things that we can share right now. They're more just into being with their friends on Discord, which is totally fine and everything. So, but yeah, I mean, they gave me this book actually that's sitting on my desk, and I'm in the middle of a book already, so I haven't started, but I had bought them this book, and they finished it and said, I think you would really enjoy this. So I'm planning, like, next time, whenever I'm finished with the book I'm already reading, like, this is next on my list, just so that we have that kind of connection point. I think it's really easy as a parent. First of all, I don't have all the answers. Like, I'm a human. I mean, I don't have all of the answers. I'm not some kind of god. As soon as you become a parent, you don't become God. And so it's important to try to connect with your kids and give them that attention. And just like that connection point is really important. Oh, and your kid is reading Unwind for school. Okay. If you haven't read the Unwind, series by Neil Schusterman. Hang on. Let me find who it's by. It's a dystopian, if you like dystopian, Neil Schusterman. It's a dystopian future type book series that I read, and I like consumed the entire series. It was so good. So I recommended it to my sister, my mom, my niece, my 14-year-old. Like, I recommended it to everyone. But if you haven't read that, it's fantastic. But sharing things like books and games and those kinds of things, it is really important. And I think a lot of parents, it's easy to overlook. It's easy to overlook that importance.
Yeah.
What is your favorite fandom?
So, well, that's a complicated question. I would just say anime in general. I think one thing I love about Japanese animation is just like extreme, just like diversity of ideas. You always have these like completely off the charts storytelling ideas that's just so different. Like, one of them will be about people who turn into animals where they're hugged, and so that it's a story about familial trauma and generational trauma, and how that specific curse, affects their ability to make long-lasting relationships. And it's just so complex, and it's just people who turn into animals when they're hugged by someone of the opposite sex. That's literally like the premise.
I like
Um,
it.
and yeah, it's Fruits Basket for those who are interested in watching it. Um, that's one of my favorite animes growing up. When I was struggling with the thing with my mom and taking care of those around me, I think that was one of the animes that got me through it, because the main character is someone who is like empathetic to a fault, but she takes care of everyone, and it's a story about meeting characters who all have their own form of trauma, and she's able to validate them. And she doesn't fix their problems, but she does tell them, like, it's okay to feel sad, it's okay to, you know go into self-preservation mode, but like, I'll be here for you. And then having, like, a lot of people had Spider-Man as their hero. Like, I think Theo is my hero in a way, because like being able to be the one who takes care of everybody whose lives, you know, everybody who's like tearing at the seams around you. That was like my ideal. That was my dream as I was a kid. Um, so yeah, I would say it's that.
That's really cool. That's one I hadn't heard of, but now I've got the link for it. See, I just add. The only thing I do with these is I just add to the list of things to check out, which is great. That's not
It's
a
a
bad
great
thing.
series.
It is. It really sounds like a good one. How did you get involved? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I actually wrote an essay about it on the Geek Therapy blog.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
it's called On Psychiatry and Anime. If you just look it up on Psychiatry and Anime, it should appear in your Google search.
All right.
It goes about around like the background that I've already talked about throughout this, but it has a few extra details. If any of you are interested in reading it,
Perfect.
let
Well,
me know what you think.
there's a link right there to it too. So it did, as soon as I Googled it, that just came up. That's what came up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, since we're on the topic of geek therapy already, how did you get involved with the Here Comes the Thought podcast and with geek therapy in general?
So the case of the kid from New York that had the stomach bug. When I was doing that rotation for my fourth year of medical school, where you do fourth year electives. And what had happened is on September 2017, I think it's 17. That was the year where I failed that exam that took me 2 years to pass for the first time. And so when I failed that test, usually you go back to med school, you go to the counselor's office, and you talk about your future, right? Um, so the day I failed was the day before Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico.
Mm.
And Hurricane Maria, what happened is that we lost communications and electricity for pretty much a year. We were like an
Wow.
entire year struggling for resources. Um, and so to, have that one-two punch of like failing this exam and then having nobody to go to, it was really tough for me. And so the first month was, just surviving through after Maria, which was like spending a whole day doing lines to get gas at the gas station. And then when you just get to the end of the line, they say they ran out of gas, and you
Oh,
spent like 6 hours just in line to get gas. And it was like that every day. No air conditioning. As soon as it was 6 p.m., it was pitch black, because there was no electricity.
wow.
Um, you couldn't charge your cell phones, and when you like charged them, like most of them didn't have any signal. I still remember the day where my my wife had like 2 bars of signal, and she turned on the cell phone, and she opened 9gag, and she was like, "This is the first meme I've seen in months," and she started like laugh crying.
Yeah.
And she was like, "I don't get this reference because like meme culture is so like temperamental,"
Hmm.
but she was so happy to see a meme. Um, so that's sort of how tough Maria was.
Yeah.
But I was lucky that after like a month of that, I had already scheduled beforehand an elective in New York, which was that elective that I did. But I had to stay at my brother's apartment. He's a surgery resident. He's working in general surgery. Um, which means he was never at home
Right. Right.
because surgery residencies are a nightmare. And so I was in New York. I was alone. Um, and so I kept company through podcasts mostly, right? I would walk around New York and feel like I was having a conversation with friends. And that's how I got acquainted with the geek therapy community, because I looked up geek and psychology, which is two things I really like, and that's what I found.
Yep.
Um, and so as I started listening to this podcast, I was like, wow, I love what these people are doing. And that's what inspired me to do like the whole Naruto thing with this kid. And so after I was done with that rotation, I was like, this is a thing. This works. Like relating to kids with their, like with their interests. And so I became part of the geek therapy community. I started like talking a lot on the Discord. And over time, I think three of us within the Discord, we were like, hey, this would be a great idea for a Steven Universe podcast. And we kept saying it because we were expecting somebody to pick it up, but nobody did. So we were like, are we doing the podcast? And then over time, we did the podcast. Luckily, one of us was Kat LaForgia, who does like the marriage and family therapy
Hmm.
podcast. So she had experience with all the editing and stuff like that, which gave Mark and I the freedom to just like go in and just talk. And so that was like my gateway drug to podcasting, just like just talking to them about Steven Universe and all the therapeutic themes inside of it. And then I decided to make my own podcast over time about like anime, and I wanted this to be my podcast. So um, I learned how to do editing and all that stuff. And I think the geek therapy community needed more anime. So I did a podcast for it. And so in Otaku Ryoho, what we do is that we choose to talk about a theme, and then we use an anime to illustrate it. So, for example, if I want to talk about, so Josue one time wanted to talk about the afterlife, and so he brought up the example of Dragon Ball, because in Dragon Ball, they have a very interesting afterlife that blends concepts of like Eastern religions with like Western religions. Like they have this concept of heaven and hell, and like angels, like people in heaven have like the halo and stuff, but like it's also heavily inspired on like Asian mythologies and stuff like that. So it was like a very interesting way to explore the afterlife and ideas we have about the afterlife and stuff like that. Um, and so every day we pick a new topic. Like I think my most recent one, which I think we're going to talk about like in a few weeks, is I wanted to bring up Fruits Basket, but I wanted to talk about like cycles and breaking cycles, like cycles of abuse or generational cycles, and how it feels to break those cycles. And so I'm going to bring up Fruits Basket, which I already mentioned in this interview. So yeah, that's usually what we do. I think it sort of stretches my therapeutic bone in a sense that like it gives me the opportunity to just like come up with topics based on media, and I think I can use that with patients whenever they're like, hey, I like the show, and I'm like instantly I know what sort of themes just like resonate with me when I talk about this piece of media. So yeah.
Yeah, I love Geek Therapy. I mean, I really think that their Discord community is wonderful. The website's wonderful. All the podcasts are wonderful. Like everything that they, I'm just in love. I don't know what to say, but they're wonderful. If anybody is not in the Discord, hasn't been to the website, please go check them out. I posted these links before, but I'll go ahead and post your socials and everything again, just in case somebody's listening and they haven't been to geektherapy.org. You should definitely go check them out for sure. Do you feel that mental health care is more focused on the person as a whole versus a medical doctor on a specific presentation of an illness or disease? And this question came up because Fee, who's in our community, was talking about kind of the healer versus doctor comparison, and just the kind of her fiance is a paramedic, and so it's kind of the comparison of the triage versus the long-term treatment. So do you feel that mental health care is more focused on the person as a whole, more than medical health care is, or do you think that it can be a little of everything all the time?
I think it's not a distinction between like mental health care and medical health care. I think it's more of a distinction between the ethics of specific practitioners within both of these fields. And I think like when you read books about like proper doctoring, you will find that they'll often come to the same conclusions that psychologists do, that we have to see people as wholes, that we have to understand cultural and societal context, that we have to take in patient narratives and, you know, empower them with their own narratives. This isn't something that I think goes against the medical model. I think it goes against the paternalistic medical model, which is the idea that, and this is something that we are taught in medical school, like there's the paternalistic model and there's the holistic model. In the paternalistic model, like I'm the professional, I have the knowledge, you take the prescription and you take it as advised, and that's what's going to help you. And so whenever I practice medicine, and the most ideal way to do it is to make the patient an active part of their treatment. And the only way to do that is information and education. Like the more tools you give your patient to make their own decisions for themselves, the more you can get out of that relationship and that healthcare. So what that means for me is that when I talk to patients about mental illness, I do want to take that part where I just go through the symptoms just to make sure that medication is going to work for them. But besides that, I want to know more about those symptoms. So if they're telling me like they can't sleep, like how does that feel for you? How do you feel that in your body? Like do you can't sleep because like you constantly feel uncomfortable, like you need to shift positions? Or do you feel like you have these thoughts that go in cycles in your head? Or do you feel like you're watching TV all night and then you go back to bed. And all of those things have different interventions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you know that screen time does sort of influence sleep. And I can tell them, like, there's filters that you can put on your TV at night so that it won't affect your sleep or stuff like that. Like, there's a different recommendation for all of these. But if you only take that part where the patient says, I can't sleep, your only answer will be medication because that's all you're taught to do.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's a reality in medical care. Like, I think a lot of doctors who learn how to be holistic in medical school, but then easily become like disheartened and hopeless, and over time they start to lose that nuance, right? And I think it's not an issue of whether it's a medical model or whether it's a mental health model. I think those are perspectives. But what I do think it's about being paternalistic and about feeling that your advice is better than giving the patients autonomy. And I
Mm-hmm.
think autonomy is one of the most important values you can have as a doctor. It's the best thing you can give a patient. Like, let them own their narrative and give them the tools to help with the aspects that they feel they need help in. I think that's the best way to do doctoring.
Yeah.
And I hope that that sort of answers the question.
Yeah.
Um,
I think I kind of knew what your answer was going to be. Like it definitely should be holistic all the time. Like you should look at the whole person, their whole situation, everything, all parts of it. And of course, there are some doctors who do that, and some who don't, and some healthcare providers who do and don't. And you just got to find the right combination. It would be nice if it was that way all the time. I think a lot more people would have a lot of better solutions if it were that way all the time. So this question comes from Fiona, and she asks, what is your day-to-day experience like as a therapist, and what was your experience like when you were in school to become one? And I know you've already kind of talked about your school experience, but maybe you can speak to the day-to-day experience as a therapist.
So, I'm not a therapist. That's the first thing. Like, I worked as a medical student. I rotated in psychiatric settings.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trained in a specific form of therapy. I've read about it. I love learning about it, but I don't practice CBT, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's not taught in medical school. In residency, psychiatrists learn CBT, and some of them learn interpersonal therapy, but that's about it. And they don't have as many hours as a psychologist does. So if you're looking for therapy, I would say like your best shot is with a psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so with a psychiatrist, there's programs that I'm applying to that focus on like psychodynamic therapy, which is like psychoanalysis, but like a bit more contemporary. Um, and I'm interested in those programs. I'm interested in learning about doing therapy, but generally that's not what psychiatrists do. What I do, and I just said do, what I do is that I form therapeutic relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what that means is that I'm a doctor first and foremost. So, yes, one of the most important things I do is prescribe medication. But in order to prescribe medication the best way possible, you have to take in the whole patient narrative. And here's an example. So, I was somebody who had, when I'm depressed, I have what we call atypical depression. And so, what we call typical depression is depression where patients sleep less because they're so depressed, and they eat less because they're so depressed, right? And I am the complete opposite in that sense. When I am depressed, I eat more and I sleep more. And part of that has to do with the fact that I have ADHD. Because I'm depressed because I'm failing my tests. So, and I feel hopeless. So I sleep all day. And as I'm sleeping all day, I'm not doing anything. But then I wake up because I can't sleep anymore because I can't go back to sleep. So I try to motivate myself to do something, right? And so with as somebody with ADHD, like my attention wavers. So I do something that stimulates me. What stimulates me and makes me feel like am contributing to my attention? Eating. So I start eating and I start eating and I start eating. And I have like this small like increase in concentration. And then when I eat too much, I have this like feeling of fullness. And then I have that Thanksgiving effect where I go to sleep because I'm so full, and like it's a toxic cycle, right? Because I'm trying to keep myself focused. Um, and so if I just say I'm struggling with sleeping, I'm struggling with eating, like I could get any sort of antidepressant. But there's a specific antidepressant for people with these sort of narratives, right? Um, and in order to get that narrative and get those details, you have to build a therapeutic relationship with your patient. You have to have your patient know that your interest is in their story, in their symptoms, in their personality, and just in them, right? And if they don't get that from you, if they feel like you're just interested in a bag of symptoms, then you're not gonna get that full story that's gonna help you find the right medication for them, right? Similarly, if if a patient doesn't trust you, um, when they have like the inevitable struggles of mental health, whether it's finding a like good scheduling to see a doctor, whether it's getting medication consistently, or even dealing with side effects. Like if they have a stomach ache as they start taking the medications, it will be easy for them to just give up, right? If they don't trust you, it's like this doctor doesn't work. Like I have these side effects and I don't like them. And ideally, what you will have is a patient that will come to you and tell you, I don't like this medication because X, Y, and Z, and you can negotiate that with them, and you can
Mm-hmm.
say this is a way you can go around it, or we can completely discontinue your medication and try something new, right? But you need to build that trust with that patient, and the way I build that trust is by developing a relationship. And that's where the geek therapy part comes in. That's where the interview part comes in. And there's research that says that just having a good relationship with a patient is already enough to improve treatment. um, just like even if you don't, if the medication doesn't work, because like most often we feel lost when we're struggling with mental illness, and having somebody that we feel listens to us and that we can vent with is already the first step. So I don't do therapy, but therapeutic relationships are therapeutic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And medication is therapeutic. So the way that looks for me on a day to day when I was working in a hospital is that I would come in the morning before my supervising doctor was even there. And what I would do is I'm gonna read all the new patients that have come in like overnight. And usually they'll have a statement which is like what we call a chief complaint, which is like just like the general gist of why they're there, right? And it's fascinating to read these chief complaints because sometimes they're like spot on and sometimes they're like way off. And you know immediately when you read them, because for example, there's this one time where I picked up the paper and it said in quotes, like this was their parents' quotes. My kid is confused about their sexual orientation. And so often when I see they're confused about their sexual orientation, it actually means we don't agree with their sexual
Right.
orientation, right?
I'm
And
confused about
so,
theirs.
yeah, exactly. Um, and so I take in all of this information that I get from like what the parents tell me, what the social worker tells me. I talk to the social worker and I talk to the psychologist, and they'll all have different versions of what's happened because they've all had different interactions with the patient, right? And so they'll tell me, she came in because this and that. I heard something about the parents. Maybe you want to ask that. Maybe something about school, their girlfriend, or something like that. And so we're just getting a general idea of what things I should talk about them with them when I get my first interaction with a patient. And so the first thing I'll do is see my new patients. And what I'll do is like the first session is just about getting to know them. Just like, what do you do? Like what I said earlier, if this was a Saturday and you had everything, like all the time to yourself, what would you do? And sort of like validate their likes, validate who they are, and try to get an idea of their strengths.
Mm-hmm.
Once I get that idea, and once I made sure that they understand that I'm trying to understand them, and I've related to them with something, that's when I start asking, like, do you know why you're here? And they'll often say like I don't know why I'm here and stuff like that. And often I'll say, so this is what it says on the paper, and this is what I think your parents have said, and this is what your psychiatrist has said. But I want to know what you think or what you believe. I want to hear your story, right? And that's usually when they open up, because
Mm-hmm.
I say, like, it's my job to be your advocate. It's my job to hear your story and incorporate that with what I've learned. And so that's usually when they open up. And just in that first session, I would want to get a general idea of what the main issue is. And I want to talk a bit about medication and about symptoms, right? So if you're having X, Y, and Z symptoms, this is why medication could work for you. And what are your concerns about medication? What are your concerns about side effects? And how just like broaching that topic by yourself and not waiting for them to come up with that topic is extremely important, right? Um, and often they'll tell you like, oh, I'm afraid the medications will blunt my feelings, or like it will take away a part of my personality. And it's my job to tell them, like, it'll take your symptoms away, but it won't take away how bad you feel about the way your mom talks about your gender
Mm-hmm.
identity, right? And it won't take away the fact that you feel like you don't fit into your friend groups, or like you have nobody you can trust. What it will do is that this thing where you can't go to sleep, or you've lost all your appetite, or you feel like you can't concentrate, those things, I think it could help. And if we can
Mm-hmm.
help you in that, I think you can then work on the hard stuff, which is like having these thoughts, discussing these thoughts, and it's sort of like rifling through the mess that you feel your mind is right now, and see what we can do about that. And often they'll respond with like, okay, I'm willing to try it out. And as the following sessions go, it will just keep talking about their current situation, how they feel they're evolving, they're growing through the process. I'll always ask about side effects, and I always list the side effects to say like, are you feeling stomach pains? I always try to preface it like, this is the boring part of the interview, but I'm just making sure that we're covering all our bases.
Mm-hmm.
And if they said like they're having stomach pains, I'll ask him, do you feel like you can handle it, or do you feel concerned about this? Um, because most of the side effects, for example, for antidepressants are temporary. They'll be gone by the first few weeks of treatment. And so I want to make sure that they feel safe to ask questions, to doubt treatment, to tell me like, I don't want to take this medication anymore if they feel that way, because then I can negotiate with them. And if they just flat out don't want to take medication, I don't want to be the one forcing them to take it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about negotiating that and making sure that there's some semblance of growth throughout the few days that they have in the hospital. Part of hospital care is that the healing doesn't happen in the hospital. Like, you don't come into the hospital mentally ill and come out completely fine.
Right.
What does happen is that triaging part that we talked about earlier. Like, the hospital is the place where you go from suicidal attempt to seeking help, and getting them to that point where they're like, you know what, I actually don't want to die right now. I still have those feelings, but I actually want to do something about them. That's what you want. out of a
Mm-hmm.
hospital stay, right? You want to get them to the point where they're like, hey, therapy might work for me, or like,
Yeah.
hey, this medication might work for me. And I know that medication isn't forever. And like, I know what steps I can take to make sure I know when I'm ready to get off medication and stuff like that. Like, preparing them for the whole process that is mental health care. I think that's the main goal when it comes to a hospital stay. And I guess in private practice, I would love to have that experience of like seeing that healing happen. But I just love the hospital work. I really do
Mm-hmm.
love the idea of getting somebody from I'm just not worth anything, I'm a piece of trash, to like, no, I'm worth something. I'm worth living and existing in this world. And I wanna live. I think that's very valuable work.
Yeah,
And that's
absolutely.
pretty much like a day in the work. That's
Yeah.
that's a day in the life, I would say.
Geeks like us, thank you so much for that raid. Appreciate it. Bodana, how are you doing? Appreciate you guys bringing your community over. We are talking about psychiatry, mental health, and geekdom with Gian here. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat, and we'll get them answered here. This is another community question. This one's from Smiles. So she asks, are there any stigmas surrounding mental illness that differ in Puerto Rico versus U.S.?
Hmm. I think that's a very complicated question because in Puerto Rico, the culture can be very it's pretty monotone. Like everybody there is Latino. It's very hard to have this sort of cultural diversity. In the US, I think the stigma about mental health is extremely diverse because there's always cultural factors that play into it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and so it plays different in different cultures. And I guess that diversity sort of, I can't say like this is how it is in the United States because like everybody is different and everybody comes in with different stigmas. In Puerto Rico, there tends to be a lot of um just ideas about weakness, like you're not mentally ill, you're just weak.
Mm-hmm.
um there's a lot of ideas about Satanism. I think it's very common in Puerto Rico. Like Puerto Rico has a very strong Catholic base, and so they tend to equate mental illness with like some sort of like demonic possession or like children being demonic. Like I have kids that are like in the LGBTQ spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
You'll always see parents saying like, they're doing Satanist stuff, and
Oh,
that's like
wow.
that's just like a narrative that's weaved like in very like closed religious groups.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So Satanism always plays like it's very common for it to play a role in discussions about stigma and mental health, like religion, Catholicism, and stuff like that. Yes, definitely. Which
Interesting.
also to sort of frame it in a different way, I came from a Catholic uh, private school. I was a very Catholic school growing up. Um, Back when I was in, 11 years old, facing all that stuff, I was the kid who sometimes in recess would go to the school chapel to pray because I didn't know what else I could do to sort of have all that strife go away. So I was a very Christian kid. And in a way, I feel that's informed my care
Mm-hmm.
because my high school specifically was into charity. And so it was because of my Christian upbringing that I felt compelled to do a lot of volunteer work, working with a lot of people with substance use. So I think the influence of religion on in my life has been positive, even though I'm no longer consider myself religious. Um, but there's two sides of that coin, and most often, I do see that religion part contributing to stigma of mental illness.
Yeah, I don't think that I would have considered the Satanism part playing into that so heavily, but it makes perfect sense when a large population is very set in Catholicism, especially. I think there's that strong connection there, and there's nothing wrong with religion. I'm not saying that at all. Don't come at me, because I used to be very religious and only stopped really going to church whenever Trump got elected, because things got weird in the church. So I stopped. But, I can definitely see the pull, especially having gone through that change in what they were talking about in the churches that I was attending whenever that election happened, and kind of the way that plays into the congregation's life and how strongly that connection is for a lot of people. I will say I love the new Pope, though. Like, I think he's been really, really great for Catholicism in particular. But yeah, that's an interesting one that I don't think that I would have connected. Smiles had another question, and she asked, how much training does a medical doctor get when it comes to mental health care?
So in medical school, there's not a lot of training. I would say it's about like 3 months training, just like learning different, like the diagnostic criteria for psychiatry and stuff like that, the treatment options. It's because most doctors don't end up going into psychiatry. Depending on the medical school, you will have certain like modules that will work a bit more on like holistic health, but I think it depends on the philosophy of the medical school, whether they think that's an important topic or not. Now, psychiatrists, they have a bit more training because actually learning CBT and different therapeutic modalities is part of their training. So for example, for me, I think my only like formal training in therapy or therapeutic modalities has been motivational interviewing, because my medical school is very into substance use and substance use treatment, and so motivational interviewing is a good way to like have that first interview with a patient where they talk about what they get from a specific drug and what are the negatives of taking a specific drug, and you're able to like empower them to make the decision that they're ready to make at this point in time. So that motivational interviewing part was part of my medical education because of my medical program. Now, when it comes to psychiatry, that's medical school is 4 years, and then psychiatry, like general psychiatry, would be 4 additional years in which it's all about mental health, right? And then if I wanted to do child and adolescent psychiatry, that would be an additional 2 years for a fellowship in which I would work in child and adolescent psychiatry. So it's a very long career path. But hopefully at the end it will be rewarding, and I will be happy to have gone through the torture that is medical school.
Yes. And hopefully you won't have too much student debt. That's always a question.
It's too late for that, but that's okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, I had to use the profits from selling a house to pay mine off. So, and I didn't go to medical school. I just went to like regular undergrad, so I don't envy you that, but hopefully, in the end, it's definitely worth it. And you get some of that paid off pretty quick. So that's such a pain. So do you have a mental health care provider, and why or why not?
Yes, I have a psychiatrist. As I mentioned before, like when I was struggling through medical school, I had both a psychologist and a psychiatrist. That helped me work with my depression during medical school. Now I'm at a point where like I'm at a much more stable point in life. But I still have ADHD. ADHD is a lifelong diagnosis, and I still have to, regularly take my stimulant medication. So I still see my psychiatrist regularly. And we talk about psychiatry as well, so that's a benefit to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it in terms of like healthcare workers,
That's great.
providers.
Jack said you are wonderful. And also Link said that you're wonderful, by the way, in chat. They're over here. They're over here
Thank
singing
you.
your praises for sure. If you weren't doing what you do now, or if you had chosen a different path somewhere along the way, what would you have done instead?
Probably psychology. I think
Yeah.
I just don't see myself doing something different, so I would pick the closest thing. So, if it's not psychiatry, it's psychology. Like I said, I wanted to be three things: a doctor, a therapist, and a teacher. If none of those works, it would be a teacher. But I think
Mhm.
like I can be a teacher and a psychologist, and I can be a teacher and a
Heck
psychiatrist.
yeah.
So it's those three. Those are the three that I love. So I would definitely have gone for psychology. And in fact, after the fourth failed attempt in that medical school exam, it was during my honeymoon that I received that score. Um,
Wow.
and we have saved up since college to go for our honeymoon, since we were high school sweethearts. And then, like during college, we already knew that we wanted to get married, but there was this little voice inside our heads of like, "You're too young to know that. Like, you can't know that you actually want to be married right now." But still, we were like, "We're pretty sure, so we're gonna start saving up for our honeymoon." And we thought we were going to Spain, but we ended up going to Japan, which was like our ultimate bucket list destination because
Mm-hmm.
we had saved up so much money over the years. Um, and on our way back from Japan, we had to make a stop in New York. And then we were told that there was a hurricane warning for Puerto Rico. So our flight got canceled. But our bags were nowhere to be found.
Oh
And
no.
then I received an email notification that my test scores were up. And I opened them and I had failed the test for a fourth time over 2 years. And I think that one time it really broke me. I just started crying, and there was this brief moment where I said, it's over. Like I'm not studying medicine anymore. I'm studying psychology. Like I'm gonna start over from scratch. Um, and there was this brief moment where that brought me a lot of joy. Just this
Mm-hmm.
idea of like it's over, like the suffering is done. And I think over the next few days, my wife would tell me like, I'll support you no matter what you do. But just think about if later on you're gonna feel like this was my second choice. And
Yeah.
so over time, I think we came to the conclusion that if I was going to stop being in medical school is because somebody kicked me out, not because I gave up. Um, like I had to just wait until somebody said like, no, you can't be here anymore. And so that next time I passed the test. Like the
That's
next time I
awesome.
took it, I passed the test.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of it was that, I had ADHD medication on my side. I had gone through, executive skills functioning,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, uh, counseling, sorry, um, executive functioning counseling. And I lived with my wife, with my best friend, and we studied together. And that was a huge help. And so I think those are the three things that got me through that. Um, but I'm just saying that for a brief moment, I really considered just starting over and doing
Mm-hmm.
psychology, which is just how comfortable I am with doing either, because I just want to work in the
Yeah.
mental health field.
And is your wife
Thank
in a
you for
similar
the
field?
question.
Is your wife in a similar field to you?
Yeah, she studied medicine with me, but
Mm-hmm.
she's applying for radiology.
Oh, very cool. Nice. Yeah. So
Yeah.
slightly different,
And,
but still a good one.
yeah, and we'll be applying this year in what you call the couples match, in which when you finish medical school, you apply for a residency, but that's done through an algorithm. Like every medical student puts his data out there and then puts his favorite residency options, and then they're interviewed, and then they go through an algorithm that picks your best spot,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep.
then wherever you're picked, that's where you're going to be like you don't get a choice. Like that's the place where you work. So you have to make sure to only list the places you're willing to work with. But they have this thing called the couples match in which you can make sure that you and somebody else are within a certain distance when you're matched in a residency program. So that's
That's
what we're going to
good.
be doing this year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that means that we'll be able to live together and not be, in
Right.
opposite sides of the globe or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be not good. So Bite asks, what is the best way to find a psychiatrist to visit that will have that holistic approach that we've kind of been talking about this whole time?
You know, I wish I knew the answer to that. When I was looking for a psychiatrist, I struggled with that same issue. And I think going into training, that's something I want to find. I definitely want to find which resources I can trust and how I can make it easier for people to find adequate resources. Right now, what I'm working, I graduated med school, and right now I'm working as a research coordinator at a medical school. I do a research on postpartum depression, actually, um, during COVID times, how the pandemic
Oh,
has affected um, pregnant women and postpartum women.
cannot
And one
imagine.
of the most beautiful, like when people usually think of research, you think just like working behind a computer. But I do interviews, and I think one of the wonderful parts of being there is that whenever I find somebody who needs resources, like I work in a hospital that has those resources, and I can call specific offices and be like, "Hey, do you have space for a patient? Okay, so
Mhm.
this is who you're gonna call," and stuff like that. And I think like there's a lot of people who want to do research, but they're like it's not as beautiful as saving lives. And I think with this experience that I'm having, like researchers are just as important
Mhm.
because they are at a point of contact where they can refer to services because they know how the system works. And I really want to be able to you know be able to put that into practice whenever I become a psychiatrist. But when it comes to looking for a psychiatrist, how do you do that? I think sadly it's going to be trial and error.
Mhm.
Um, I think you can look for certain communities. I know in the geek therapy community, we often say like, "Oh, I need a geek therapist from this place," or stuff like that. Um, Sadly, there's not. I don't think there's enough psychiatrists in the geek therapy community, but
Mhm.
we're ever growing. I know a Chicago one. I know one from London. But I think we're ever growing, and we'd love to see more psychiatrists in the community.
Mhm. Yeah. So it's time for the magic moment, and I have a special tool for this magic moment. I'm going to wave a magic wand here in just a second, and you get to eliminate one common opinion, misconception, or theory surrounding mental illness, disabilities, or talking about mental health. So I'm going to wave this magic wand, and then you get to eliminate it and tell us what you're eliminating today.
I would eliminate the idea. Um, so this is a strange way to go about it, but I would definitely remove the idea of like psychology of nature versus nurture. And the
Mm-hmm.
way I go about this of biology versus psychology, I think people get hung up on the idea of like either genetics and neurotransmitters is everything we have, and so there's no real choice. Like it's just a biological process that determines our emotions and blah and stuff like that, right? Or the other side where it's like, no, like which comes before the chicken or the egg? Like it's the emotion that makes us neurotransmitters and stuff like that. And I think people struggle with that idea of like biological determinism of like, am I in control of my own emotions and stuff like that? And I think what people don't realize is that it's not that the neurotransmitter serotonin makes you feel happy. It's that when you're happy, that is your neurotransmitters shooting. And when you smile, that is your neurotransmitter is constricting your facial muscles. And when you think about somebody you love and you get that warm feeling inside, that is happening at the same time. It's not that one causes the other or vice versa. It's that it's all happening. That is the thing happening. Like the neurotransmitter shooting is you feeling happy. It's just two different ways of explaining the same phenomenon. And a lot of people who feel like their biology will determine like who they are. Like I have a big predisposition for depression and stuff like that. Just think about all the many things that we do subconsciously. For example, there's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, motor cortex, which is the one that translates emotional states to motor reactions. That's laughing, smiling, right? When you're happy, you do these things and you don't think about it. Like they are, for all intents and purposes, a biological reaction that we're all hardwired for, right? But I assure you that if you trained yourself to be absolutely soulless, whenever you see a like don't laugh or smile video, you can get yourself to a point where you don't laugh or smile when you see something funny. And that just goes to show that we are plastic beings. We are like we can change, right? And there's nothing about our biology that will determine 100% who we are. And we always have a sliver of control and volition that can make a difference, no matter how much we inherit, how much trauma, how much history, and how much like biological just like a predisposition we have. We always have a choice. And I think part of the beautiful work of mental health is letting the patient know that they have that choice. That at some point everybody has the potential for change, and you should never feel like I'm just depressive and that's just who I'm going to be for the rest of my life, because there's no way I can surpass this amount of trauma. Like there's always a way. And I think that's the hope that every mental health practitioner has, that we can make a difference, and you can make a difference for yourself, and we can all change. I think if we all believe that, we could move somewhere better. And it's hard to believe when you're going through it, but I think it's our job to give them that hope. I think that's pretty much sums up, I think, what the work of mental health is.
Absolutely. Jack said so many outdated ideas within the field. Neuroplasticity is one idea still getting struck down in certain circles. Absolutely. And it's one of those things that, there's still lots of study going on about that. And the more that comes out, I think the more what you're saying is just being proven, right? Like it's not being disproven. It's just backing that up, that I think we have more control if we put in the effort than we think that we do. Change is always possible feeds into the idea of forgiveness inside and outside ourselves. Yes, Mind and Life Institute has been at the forefront of this for years. Yeah. Yep. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time on this Monday night, and I am really glad that we were able to finally get together and do this. So thank you for taking the time. And chat, give me just a minute. I'm going to disconnect with our guest, and then I will be back playing some Minion Masters and RuneScape. And if Angel is still here, we might even play some words on stream. So make sure you stick around for that. And again, thank you for your time tonight. I appreciate you.
Thank you all so much for listening and giving me the time of day.
Absolutely.
Have a nice night.
And that wraps up another episode of Even Tacos Fall Apart. I found that conversation absolutely fascinating, and I hope that you also enjoyed exploring the intersection of psychiatry, mental health, and geekdom as much as I did. Reflecting on that conversation, it's very clear that the journey to mental wellness is truly a unique and deeply personal one. Whether we're navigating the challenges of our own minds or supporting loved ones through their struggles, the importance of seeking comprehensive care, embracing our interests and hobbies, and recognizing the change and the power of change and the power of growth cannot be overstated. So as you go about your day, remember that you are not alone in your journey. We're all in this together, navigating those ups and downs of life one day at a time. And if you ever need a reminder or a listening ear, you know where to find us. Before we part ways, I want to take a moment to express my gratitude to each and every one of you for tuning in and being a part of this incredible community. Your support means the world to me, and I am so grateful for having you along for the ride. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the podcast, and leave a review if you can. Your feedback and engagement helps me continue to grow and improve, and it helps me reach more people and bring you the content that you love. If you're looking to connect, there are some links down in the description. Make sure to click through and join our community. Until next time, take care of yourselves, embrace your quirks, your passions, and remember, even when life feels like it's falling apart, there's beauty in that chaos. This is MommaFoxFire signing off, and I'll catch you in the next one.